This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture. Episode 4, The Mothers of Invention's Freak Out. This conversation was recorded on December 17th, 2021. This is Joël. And this conversation was great for me for a couple of reasons. The first being that I was able to talk about my relationship with Frank Zappa's music. This is something I've never really talked about with anybody, so that was really significant for me. But the other reason why this conversation was important to me was because I was left with some really fascinating questions and considerations about Frank Zappa's music. I certainly feel like I came away from this conversation with deeper and broader places to go in terms of thinking about what he's done and how he's done it. So this conversation was very enriching for me. Now, if you've been listening to our podcast, this being episode 4, you've probably noted that Rob and I really like to talk about concept albums, but we like to engage with other people about them as well. So, with that in mind, we would love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any observations, you can contact us at sonicventurespodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, here's the conversation, and thanks for listening. So here we are again.
Absolutely.
For another immersive conversation. The Mothers of Invention's Freak Out.
Zappa.
Yes, Frank Zappa. Yeah. So, was this your first listening of this album? Had you heard it before?
It was my first experience of it as an album. So I never got a hold of the album before.
Right.
But I had heard the odd selective track back in the day.
Yeah.
And sort of here and there. But definitely had not experienced this as the album until we decided to tackle it. And I've been living with it for about 6 weeks, which is great.
And how is this first listening for you?
The very first listen, it took about 2 or 3 listens to sort of find my sort of listening posture with the album.
Right.
Initially, that first listen is I'm too analytical in my. I'm sitting down to do my first listen, and the brain was immediately trying to organize and make sense of things and think of things as I was listening. And it took a few listens for that not to happen.
Okay.
So, and at the same time, it helped that as I listened more, mm-hmm. That familiarity with things sort of opens doors to receiving it.
Right.
And so it 2 or 3 listons until I was at a comfort level to listen.
Oh, okay.
And
very well said.
Yeah. So that was my approach. What about you? What was your?
Well, it's interesting because when we decided to do this album, something very unexpected happened for me, which is I couldn't listen to it right away because I actually had to take a week of reflecting on what I would call my relationship with Frank Zappa.
Right.
So
okay.
I'll really compress this as best I can. So
sure.
I heard this album for the first time back when I was probably like 18 or 19 when I was listening to a whole bunch of other Zappa albums. So I don't actually remember the first time I heard this album, but I have a very special warm place in my heart for Frank Zappa conceptually, because when I was in my last year of high school and I was starting to go through that process of, what am I going to do musically? I came across this interview with Frank Zappa, and I had never read anything about him before. I'd heard his music. My friends were really big into him because of the humor, right? And the criticism of everything, in a lot of things in his lyrics. And musically, I was interested in it. It was complex. It was interesting. But I was reading this interview with him, and at the beginning of the interview in a guitar magazine, I can't remember if it was Guitar Player, Guitar World, they asked him a question about being a guitar player. And he said, well, I don't consider myself a guitar player. I consider myself a composer that plays guitar. And that blew my mind. It was like a really helpful insight that he gave me by reading that. And so ever since I had that moment with Zappa, I've always had that kind of connection with him. Just to conceive of how I approach music in that way. So the first week of experiencing this album was actually not listening to it. It was reconnecting with what I kind of went through with my own process with Zappa. Because along with that insight that I got from him, I also had some challenges emotionally listening to his music at times.
Okay. Because
I didn't know where he was coming from. There was like a hall of mirrors of humor. It would go pretty dark. It would go very light. So for me at that age, and a few more years on, it was sometimes hard for me to feel like I could take Zappa seriously. I didn't know how to take Zappa seriously lyrically. Musically was not an issue. I felt like I understood, which we'll probably get into as we talk about this album.
I'm sure.
But for me, this time that I listened to the album, I had to work into it. But I don't actually remember the first time I heard the album. I know that it was there.
Right.
There were other albums that stuck out more, like Weasel Rip My Flesh, Shut Up and Play Your Guitar, albums like that I had more of a relationship with. But this one was one of the albums that was of the other ones. I mean, he recorded over 60 albums.
Right. And I think of the time period that both of us would have been exposed to Zappa and how we would have been exposed to him. My impression of Freak Out and the very first Mothers album and the first few Mothers albums was that, they were a product of Frank directing a band.
Yeah.
But it took him a few albums to get rid of those bums, kind of thing, and that it wasn't something that the Zappa that everyone revered and talked about in terms of the legitimacy of him sort of arose once he had taken off those shackles of being tied to the Mothers' original group.
Right.
And so this is based on not having heard this music.
Right.
Just that my impression then was that somehow these first couple albums weren't full Zappa, and because they were recorded so long ago and so early that they were somehow not going to be as good, that they were like, we'll call it freshmen in a sense. That was my impression before I heard them.
And I think it's a valid impression because there are a number of things I heard about Zappa and things that he's done where, again, it would put me in this place of, okay, what does he think is good?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Like that's, what does he want us to listen to?
And even when I've looked at the liner notes for Freak Out, and how there's, making a comment about a track and then saying, ho hum,
right.
my,
yeah.
Where for me, back in the day, not now, but back in the day, that was something that was uncomfortable for me.
Sure.
Because I didn't know where he was coming from. So what you're saying about the Mothers of Invention is interesting, because he was doing so many things right out of the gate. You know,
Yeah.
he was managing, he was conducting, he was writing, he was building his business right from the start, music business, publishing business. And so, the Mothers of Invention, I think it does, this album, Freak Out, because I mean, we could talk about Zappa for a long time with all, you know, his canon. But there's a lot of his tropes, musical tropes. There's a lot of his devices that are already there.
Yeah, and that
so even
surprised me.
Oh, interesting.
You know, like I said, my impression was that these albums were probably not that good. That was, you know, and some of that may have been shaped also by the Rykodisc releases, the original CD releases of Zappa's catalog back in the 80s, I think, late 80s. It might have been early 90s, but late 80s. And there was no attention during those re-releases given really to Freak Out or any of the first few albums, although they were well done. The album I've been listening to has been a Rykodisc re-release. But the other albums got way more attention.
In some interviews I read with him, he said that even those earlier albums were still very lucrative for him. People still wanted them.
Yeah.
So in terms of Freak Out, what I found really interesting about listening to it, because as I said, I'm much more familiar with later works, Frank Zappa works, is that a lot of him is there. Even though there's these really interesting improvisational moments, especially at the end of the album, I really feel that he's there in a lot of that. And so even though what you're saying, there was a shift after the Mothers of Invention, I still think that his fingerprint is really strong on there. It's not just his voice. Mm-hmm. A lot of the instrumentation, his use of pitched percussion, how he will kind of hijack the rhythm and the flow of things to make a lyrical statement. How he uses, how he thinks about sound as opposed to just music. There's a lot of that in it. So it's interesting for me to have gone and listened to this album and say that, I can hear a lot of his identity already. Because if I think about him as a composer, which I do, I think of him as the way he expressed himself. That's the thing about composition. You can say it for songwriting and any artist development, that there are different arcs of creative development.
Sure.
And there are some that just come out of the gate with things already that are potent, and they reach people, or they're very clearly an identity of that artist. And I feel like this album has that with him.
Yeah,
sure.
I definitely, on listening, realized that my prejudice or my take of what I was about to discover was wrong, in the sense that I think I fully agree with you that Zappa's imprint is all over this album. Like it's the tropes and the technique and the things that you listed there, they're all Zappa. And you know, as you sort of listen deeper, you really start to catalog those things and become very, very aware of them. And especially when you get to the point when you start anticipating them before they happen. Right. And you're really communing with Zappa at that point, like, because you've sort of gotten yourself into a state where you're anticipating his next choice, his next movement. And so that the continuity of those things in their diversity as well, which is an interesting sort of duality, the continuity of diversity that goes through that album is it could only be Frank. You know, there is an auteur there, in even without the biographical understanding of how that album was recorded and everything we know about that, you can. These things aren't accidental happenstances that just happen to be there. The auteur is very much in control.
Right. And even though there's a lot of improvisation.
Absolutely.
Well, I should say a lot of improvisation at the end. You're right. I think so. And so when I was listening to this, I was one question I had for you.
Okay.
Is, well, first of all, I should set up that the reason why we chose this album, part of the reason why we chose this album is because it is considered to be the first rock concept album.
Yeah.
And on top of it all, it's a double album, which is also, we could say, kind of a Frank thing to go, to go all the way.
Right.
I'm not just going to do an album, I'm going to do a double album. But the influence of this album as a concept album,
yeah,
I was curious what your impression is of this as a concept album.
Well, going back to our first discussion, which was loosely exploring the question that kind of is going to run through all our conversations, is the question of what is a concept album, is sort of one that we're revisiting through this process.
Yeah.
And to understand this as a concept album and its influence, you do have to almost go back as a listener and forget a little of what you know, and try and experience the album as like in its historical newness. Like, what are the things on this album that separate it from other albums of the time? And that question of what is a concept album, well, Frank said it's a concept album. So there's that, but by declaration, there's a concept album. If you say it is, so be it,
Right.
And I also think that also holds true if you're a listener. If you experience as such, I think it is as well. And I think that's something that I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through. But this album, for me, there are so many things, both just as a general idea of a concept album, really, which just sort of says, and it's very loosely a concept album in the sense it doesn't have to, it hasn't defined concept albums. It's left concept album sort of as an undefined thing, an open thing, like an open source idea.
Yeah.
So you could say Frank was the first, he open sourced the idea of concept albums with this album.
Yeah.
So I think that addresses a bit the specifics of how I experienced it as a concept album. I really sort of saw it as sort of like an opening of the door of the form, and here's what we're doing with it. And at the same time, there are so many things on this album, song by song, that you can go and say, 2 years after this prefigured or anticipated or influenced, so many different musical tangents, so many different groups, and at the same time pulled from the past. So while it's pulling from the past, it's also, predicting or prescribing the future, song by song.
Yeah.
And some songs, you can find 4 tangents off the same song that went in 4 different directions, that became fully developed musical tangents that are alive and well today, in our collective memory and understanding. So, there are so many different things on this album that sort of speak to future albums and future movements in pop music or rock music, music in general. I was surprised and so pleased to sort of we are correct in that this is the album we're doing, because this is the album we should be doing. Like, and like there's been a gap in my musical education, but this album, I could see it in its negative space. Like when you watch one of those crime shows, and the killer is standing there and he's bashing somebody, and the blood spray leaves like an outline of negative space on the wall, and that's how they knew the guy was standing there. Well, this album has been there, sort of in my looking back. It's like, oh, here's the point of origin. I never knew that. I didn't know that. But it's always been there. I could feel the presence in its absence of my education. So amazing.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because it also draws from sources that were not mainstream either, like musique concrète.
Yeah, entirely new,
or very freeform improvisation. Using extended techniques like like tape, speeding up the tape, slowing down the tape, those kinds of things. But it's interesting what you're saying about it as a concept album. The way you just put all that, I don't think I can encapsulate everything you said. But one thing I noticed in listening to the whole album is there's this amazing shape and this arc of musically and even lyrically, beginning with a firm foundation. Yes. And then as the album goes, it just spirals away. It just breaks open. And there was, I guess you could say, I had a theory about that, a kind of symbolism about that.
Now, before you go on,
but I don't know if I want to go there.
I know I think we both have ideas on the through line on this discussion, and they're exciting sort of things that we want to talk about. But we don't want to drop them on the mic right away. It's like, oh God, I guess that was it. But I'm anticipating a little bit of what you're saying there, because equally my sort of through line, or my thing is that process arc is very much you really, I experienced that as a listener to this album, and that orientation formed fairly early and helped me through the album. And then as I was no longer trying to organize the sort of what I was hearing in that sense, everything sort of was revealed to me. Like I definitely found my through line as a listener, and it totally opened up my experience and really enriched it in ways that I thought allowed the music to sort of exist on several different layers for me, both as individual tracks, as sides, individual sides, as part of an overall arc, as a listener, and then this other idea of process. And what was actually happening there. And so it really opened up multi-layered or channels of experience that enriched my listening to this, for sure.
One thing about this album too, there's just I would say there's a little bit of it that surprised me, because as I said, the last time I heard it was many years ago, was the presence of noise guitar.
Yeah, that old especially school acid rock.
But in the Brain Police, especially at the beginning of Brain Police, it's almost, I would say, beyond acid rock.
Brain Police is, Brain Police, it starts off, it's Iron Man, it's Black Sabbath.
But that's what I mean is it isn't, because what happens at the beginning of Iron Man isn't noise guitar.
Okay.
Right? So I felt like there's already a stripping down of what you're supposed to do with an instrument. There's a I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's this beautiful segment that Zappa did on Steve Allen, I think it was.
Okay.
And he brought out a bicycle.
Oh, yeah, yes.
And he
yeah,
demonstrated how you can make music with the bicycle.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first encountered that, it was after I had already gone through a whole bunch of music school.
Sure.
So I'd studied the history of these ideas. Zappa was drawing from other sources on that, right? There was a whole school. There were schools of art music that were delving into this. You know, John Cage had done prepared piano in the mid 30s.
Sure.
Right. So he was drawing from that, and he was presenting it in such a way, like he came out with a suit.
Yeah.
And he seemed very erudite and very, very, I don't want to say bourgeois, but he seemed, very prim and proper.
Yeah, he played it straight.
He played it very straight.
Very straight.
But his point was very simple, is that all of these things are sounds.
Yeah.
So going back to the noise guitar component here is that, noise guitar was something we were seeing more with Hendrix. But Hendrix hadn't really happened yet.
No,
right? It was just before Hendrix. But it's not done. This again, I would say, is coming from this compositional thinking. It's not done as a sensationalized tool, right? Like a means to say, "Oh, look what I'm doing! Isn't it really clever?" There's a genuine, honest expression I find that comes up in this album about using sound,
right,
as opposed to
as textures, right?
As textures, and as opposed to saying this is what music is.
Yeah,
it's more about look at sound.
Yeah,
and when Hendrix was doing what he was doing, to simplify it, it was very much in a very particular context. That that moment, especially on the Brain Police, it isn't like that.
No.
I find that when I heard that beginning of Brain Police, I was really taken by it.
Right. Well, you can tell it's like in songwriting. When you're got a guitar in your hand, right? You can write through the medium of your guitar, and the guitar and how you play guitar is sort of dictating what you write. And Hendrix, his facility with guitar. As he was holding guitar, those colors and those things that he did were him because he was holding the guitar at the time, right? And so they came about channeled through him and through the guitar. Yeah. Whereas Frank is, especially when you consider all the other textures and elements where he's using, we'll call it the palette, the sound palette, as an arranger, as a someone doing orchestration. That the guitar, he didn't sit at home and go, oh look, here's this cool sound, I'm going to write a song around it. He conceived of the texture in his head in the same way they use the theremin, or the same way they use the kazoo, or the same way they use some of the percussive elements that you talked about. And that goes here. Yeah. And then he went and played it. Yeah. Right? So you can see the maturity. He was 26, right? Something like that. The maturity already, and the sophistication of using sound and the elements at his disposal to paint by sound.
I think it's interesting you saying this, because speaking of Frank Zappa as a composer and myself as a composer, for that age, for what he was doing, I wouldn't say it's all that extraordinary. Okay. What I would say is extraordinary is that he got it on an album with a bunch of other people. So I agree with you, though. Yeah. And that's why I said earlier on that you can hear the Frank Zappa fingerprint on this right away. So I'm not denying what you're saying, but for me, the part about Zappa, Frank Zappa, and the Mother Inventions, and this album in particular, because we have to talk about Tom Wilson. Yeah, we have to bring him into this mix. I think. Sure. Is that he got that to happen. He got it together. When I was in university, I was composing music. There was a lot of stuff just given to me. Yeah. If you kicked me out of university and said, okay, Now you get a concert off the ground and you get all the performers together, and that's a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
It's actually, and this is not to take away from Zappa's work or any other composer's work or any songwriter's work, is to conceive of a song or an idea in your bedroom or in your living room. That's great. But then there's something about making that stuff go to its completion.
Yeah.
So this is the other thing I really appreciate about this album, because I can't imagine the things between the lines of that era for him to get this album, for them to get this album completed.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I would think that we need to bring up Tom Wilson.
Sure.
But the whole idea of what you were saying about, he conceived of this part in the music. So the guitar part and the guitar noise and that to me is the idea of being a composer who plays guitar.
Sure.
Because it doesn't mean that everything he does is coming through that one instrument.
Right.
There's other instruments that are needed.
Yeah, and his creative acumen is not that's not the point of origin.
Right.
That defines the product, the end product. Although historically we know he had for years access to recording studio of his own.
Yep.
And had done all kinds of his sort of self-made projects leading up to that.
Yeah, it's
point.
how he redefined the recording contract.
Yeah.
He was the person who did that because he was able to record 5 albums in a year or something. So, but up until this point, I heard this on this great interview with Dweezil Zappa and Mark Maron.
Yeah.
And Dweezil Zappa talked about how Frank Zappa wanted to get out of his contract because it was a 5-year contract, and the contract was based on how many albums.
Yeah.
And at that time, there was an assumed amount of time to record an album. It was a year.
Yeah.
So they never said about the time. They just said the number of albums in the contract. So to get out of his contract, he just went ahead in his home studio and he recorded 5 albums.
Right.
And just bang, they're done.
Miles Davis did the exact same thing,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. It's a brilliant move.
Yeah, it's like, okay, here you go. I just need a weekend, for...
Yeah, and that, I think that also connects to another area of Zappa, which I don't think we'd have time to touch on, but his business mind.
Yeah.
I mean, that's another part about him that I've always had a lot of respect for. And because for me, myself, it's not a strong point.
Sure.
But going back to Freak Out, just the idea that, I need percussion, I need these performers, to envision that stuff, that's great. But to actually manifest it and to get it to happen,
execution. Right.
Execution,
That's it's in my pages of notes here that I've taken through all these different listenings. Execution was written several times. Just for different reasons, but of course, talking on the mic and trying to refer to your notes while you got like pop filters in front of your eyes. I mean, good luck, Rob, looking at your notes. So you just trust me. Somewhere I took notes where I have some sort of thought that's organized, and then we'll talk about it after. But yeah, it's. The other thing I'm quite conscious of when we talk about this, and it came up when we talked about Dark Side of the Moon as well, is that there are people that have done a lot of scholarship about this album and Frank Zappa, and there's a lot of detail and knowing that comes from from having done that legwork and done that reading, and what often gets neglected though is the experience of these albums, the experience of these music. So, as I think the all the details that are informative to enrich the experience of the music, we talk about those, but equally there is an experience of these albums, and there wasn't a lot of people talking about the experience of listening to this album that wasn't just repeating what Zappa wrote in the Zappa book, or what 2 or 3 major articles about this album were sort of self-referring. So like you could go song by song and everyone says the same thing about the song.
Right.
But no one tells you what they thought of it. You know, like,
well, here's our opportunity.
Yeah. But so, you need both, right?
Yeah,
One,
sure,
or both, at least enrich that experience. So like for me, it's important to be able to bring in from the outside. You know, we've done our legwork on different things in our own ways. And, but, you know, not to forget, like at the, I don't want to use a tropey expression, but at the end of the day, we're left with the music.
Well, I said back in the day already, so.
Well, back in the day is one of those general undefined things that suggests that we might be old and there might be a day when we weren't. and there might be a day before that when we weren't even here. And, but yeah, back in the day is a great catch-all because like everyone understands it, even if it's completely undefined.
At any age, you can use it.
At any age.
So then tell me about your experience of this album.
Every listen to every song continues to yield more surprise and more appreciation for how much orchestration is happening in that mix and how well mixed everything is.
Yeah.
I actually, it took me a little bit to get, there's a fair amount of reverb and wash in the mix.
Yeah, at times, yeah.
Yeah, and so it took me a bit to kind of attune my ears to hear everything, because it was, the EQ on it was, it's got a specific sort of curve, right? That and so I didn't hear it right away. Like it took a few listens again to sort of find my place with this, but it's with every song there are, there's not just one guitar part, there's not just two guitar parts, there's so many different guitar parts, there's so many different other things, like I referenced there's theremin, there's kazoos, there's
pitch percussion.
Well, and that brings me to something, my understanding of Zappa, and compositionally as well. Like if I remember, he wanted to be a drummer initially, right?
I've heard a few different stories. What I heard was his first attraction to music was how it looked on the page.
Okay.
And I believe that the first music, album music he got was a 45 he stole out of a music store, and it was the music of Edgar Varese.
Oh, the ionization one?
Yes. Yeah. So that, as far as that,
I just have this
foggy in my memory.
I have this memory of reading something where he was talking about rudiments and drumming rudiments. And I started to look at everything he was doing compositionally, in particular the pitch percussion. You've got and I don't even by sound I don't know how to differentiate all of them, but there was like sort of xylophone or marimba or
there's both, I believe.
Vibraphones. I can only imagine what they wheeled in and out of the studio. And it wasn't just one time. It wasn't on just one song. That stuff was on every song. Yeah, it was all there.
Well, and that to me is a Zappa fingerprint, is giving melody to percussion.
Yeah,
that's something he does a lot. So his early days with drumming or percussion, you might be right. My mind's foggy on it.
Okay.
I didn't put my focus there. Like I said, with Zappa, there's so many different places you could focus on his work. But I think that is a huge, for me anyways, it's a huge Zappa fingerprint, is percussion supports or is melody.
Right. And I thought that he was, and I thought that part of what empowered that for him was his facility in either picking up or understanding rudiments and that he took basic rudiments.
As a composer, you need them.
Yeah, and he sort of masterfully took those rudiments and applied them across multiple instruments.
Yeah, so whenever you're writing for any instrument, you have to understand it to some degree.
Yeah.
Right? And then the beauty of the process is that you work with the actual professional, or the person who, let's say, who has that relationship with it, who can execute it. There's the word again. Since you started off with a blood and gore analogy.
Yeah.
The outline of blood.
Yeah. Oh, right. I forgot about that. Yeah.
But by working with the performer, you get to learn more about what is possible. So you actually start to develop a relationship with that instrument through a performer.
Yeah.
And by nature of that, you not only get to perfect what you want to do, but it opens up new possibilities for you. So just as an aside, from your experience, I thought at times how educational this first album must have been for Zappa.
Yeah.
Yeah. But back to your experience with the album.
Yeah, like you, that arc. Once I got a sense of the arc of the album, I could sort of get comfortable and follow that storyline of that arc. I'm not a huge. I'm not particularly interested in doo-wop myself. It's I don't hate it, but it's, like doo-wop had already been lampooned, after Zappa by it's like someone I would have been exposed, like Sha Na Na or something.
Right.
It's like, so Zappa sort of going back to doo-wop. I had to first. I almost had to tell myself I had to sync up to his timeline and what he would have been sort of paying homage to, and also deconstructing and reconstructing that form that didn't seem that significant or interesting to me. It's sort of, as we'll call it, postmodern rock or modern rock kind of guy. So once I kind of got synced with what he was looking at, and starting out from, I did start to enjoy the pastiche of those songs, and was able to really sort of see that there was a lot of care and attention to those, that to the point where they're almost authentically those songs, as they could almost be the songs he's lampooning, or that he's satirizing, by just toning it back just a little bit. Like he's that close to some of them.
Yeah.
And sort of getting comfortable and sort of allowing that experience to come through, and just that fine line initially of
that's compositional skill.
Amazing, right?
Yeah, and I'm with you on that, where they could be those songs, except that he adds those things that he does to make his comments and to when he does parody like that.
And also there's elements, there's a sophistication to those arrangements that almost could have been those songs if they had matured. Like he's adding elements to them that, Zappa elements, but these, he's got these fanfares and these multiple sort of melody lines and interplay that's sort of coming in, adding more layer and depth to the arrangement. So, taking it out of just a simple dumb rock pastiche or something, and sort of opening it up, which, because it's so because it would have been surprising maybe to hear those elements at the time, they would have been sort of not just comic, but perhaps off-putting, to a listener. But so showing his mastery of that form, being able to add new elements to it that would suggest where that form would have evolved had it not collapsed,
Right.
but then his lyrical, and we'll call it some of the idiosyncratic elements that bring the satire, bring the undoing to each piece. Just like you say, it shows will, it shows intent, and control,
care. That's the part about Zappa, I think, that's a word that doesn't come up. And that was actually part of my process with him, is he does care.
Yeah.
He really does care. But so in listening to this album, I could see why I took that time before to step into it, because it's been a while actually since I've listened to any Zappa. But what you're saying about the sophistication and the execution and the understanding of what he's referencing just adds to that, as I think I called it before, the hall of mirrors of humor.
Yeah.
Right? Like, well, how does he really feel about this music if he's doing this?
Yeah.
So for me, listening to this album, I like you, it was the third listen where I was able to sit into it. It's for different reasons.
Yeah.
But one thing that I found really intriguing for me was the title and the implications of the last track, The Return of the Son of Monster Magnet. So all the titles of the songs pretty much made sense to me except for the last one.
Yeah.
So I went ahead and I researched Monster Magnet. I don't know if you did this, but you probably did.
Keep going.
And I learned that it was an actual toy that came out, I believe, in the 60s. And it was this magnet. And it was supposed to be this very powerful magnet, and it was able to hold up to 20 pounds. And the magnet, I think it was a variety of colors, but it had this kind of angry face molded around these two magnets. And it had this, in the write-up I read about it, it referenced the face having like a genie, almost pseudo-Asian image. And the mouth is open. And the mouth is open. And it just, when I read about that, I went into this place symbolically with the whole album about magnetism.
Okay.
And what happened for me was then I listened to the album again, and I found that I was listening to a lot of things which are these very well executed parodies or recreations of music as these powerful magnets, right? You hear that music, you know it's doo-wop. You hear that music, you know it's jazz, you know it's rock, you know it's country, whatever form it may be. And how at the very beginning of the album, it talks about Mr. America and all the things that Mr. America is doing. Stop it, because the freaks don't care. The freaks don't want it. The freaks are hungry. And starting there, and then so many of the songs in the middle of the album, they're about love.
Yeah.
Which is highly attractive. Some might say the epitome of attraction is love. And how there's all these ways that love is explored, is criticized, and especially criticized in terms of, let's say, the American dream or the American culture of that time. And as the album goes along, those things, by the time you get to the last three tracks, those grounding musical and lyrical elements start to come away from themselves. They start to come apart. So the magnetic pull of that culture, let's say, American culture, or the pillars of that society are starting to let go of that magnetic hold, and they're starting to come apart. So by the time you get to the end of the album, everything that had cohesion, magnetic pull unto itself, has dissipated and it breaks apart. But when I listened to the album again, I had this interesting inversion of that idea of magnetism because of the Hungry Freaks part.
Okay.
And I started to conceive of how maybe the album is not only about something that's about a particular cohesion and attraction sustaining itself, but it's about how there are other things to be attracted to that can, by virtue, draw you away from them. So when I think about Zappa as a composer, I think about somebody who's attracted to sound. He's not invested in any particular form of music, right? It's the bicycle. I can ride this bicycle, but by the way, I can also make music on it. So the album, that use of the idea of the monster magnet was interesting for me because it made me experience the whole album, but the music especially, as demonstrating a kind of creative physics by it coming up by starting with where these things are really held together. This is how things work. This is how things are put together. And then as the album goes along, he slowly takes shots at that, or he opens it up and changes it a little. But by the end, they've let all that go. And they're being attracted to other things, other ways to use sound, other ways to think of music.
Right.
And I found that a really beautiful experience. And I would never have had that when I first heard it, obviously, because here I am talking about it.
Sure. So that really speaks to anyone's ability to sit down and listen to this album through and through, right? And with all concept albums, if the idea of a concept album as having some sort of unifying conceptual element, either very loosely or very specifically, one of, in order to, if you are supposed to experience it as a in its totality, or as a sort of a single entity, you need the time and the space and I think enough repetition to take that journey and listen through and through to get that experience. If you don't have that time and space, I think that the experience of that is very slippery. I think you don't get it. I think it can be hard to achieve. It can be elusive. But spending that time is part of why I'm attracted to concept albums, and part of why I'm attracted to the album as a format. It's yes, there's all these individual songs, and as we go through these songs, I mean, there's songs I really like on this album as songs, and then there's songs I go, isn't that clever? And then I'll integrate those into my understanding of maybe that side and say, okay, well, this song experienced as a side, enriches in a different way. It's sort of that sort of liminal idea of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. And you can only get that if you experience the whole, right? To get to that next sort of level. But as you break down the album into those things, the again, part of what I am really attracted to is just allowing for that to happen, allowing for the music to sort of get into you, to open up your mind to thought, to wherever the journey takes you, and to wherever you want to think about, as part of that. So, as you described with I like that idea of the magnetism and the pulling apart, those songs on side one, as you can feel that they are slightly pulled apart already, right?
Yeah.
And that's where that's why I think the rudiments and the compositional elements are so visible. You know, if you look for them, because there's just that little bit of separation that has made them not self-aware, but aware to you. Like it just a little bit easier to see them as they're just slightly pulled apart.
Yeah, you're actually taken on a journey and you're taken care of.
Yeah.
Right? How far down this rabbit hole do you want to go with us?
Absolutely.
And then you go down and you go down and you go down and that happens. And what I appreciate what you said about the process of listening to the album, I think for me, I was thinking about their process of making this album.
And that's my through line.
Oh, okay.
So, but yeah.
Whoa, I don't want to take that away.
But but absolutely. Like, because there's art is, and we could spend, multiple conversations just talking about the nature of art and
isn't that our plan?
I think it might be. Lordy. Yeah. So at any point that we say anything, it exists. There exists 10 conversations that actually will justify, describe, or completely nullify what we've just said. That I'm sure we could have. So we commit to nothing, but say anything. The experience, whatever the experience of this album is, Zappa's intent is only a small part of it. Because the experience of a work of art it has a lot more going to it than the artist's intent. That's an element of it. But there's, he may have an intentional through line, but the work of art exists outside of that. So. That said, I just want to make that sort of point that, there's lots of things that we can read about or people can sort of say, this is what Zappa was trying to do.
Right.
Yes. But the experience of this album as a listener and where it, sort of went into the world after it was released, is it's multiple. It's a multiplicity of experiences. And which is why repeated listens from me as a listener yield different journeys every time, and celebrating that is part of what I like about whether listening to this album or listening to Dark Side of the Moon. You're going a different place every time. If you want to.
Yeah.
But yeah, for me, my through line on this album was that. It was, as a concept album, it was less about it as a concept album, whereas for me, it was almost like the whole recording of this album was itself sort of a performance art piece of recording an album. So that the concept album exists within the process of recording the album. So Zappa didn't sit down and say, I'm going to record a concept album, or I'm even, the whole, or even an album, in the sense that I think the album became the album at the end of the process, but that it was the process itself and how he recorded it, and how the album itself grew from a band that got signed to record an album to a band that released a double album called Freak Out with the material that was on it, and this getting more and more experimental as you worked your way through the album. I know that we'll say it. Biographers and musicologists will be able to tell you where and when every song was recorded, at what session, and had it been recorded before, and was it a new song or an old song as they bring it into this. But the album generally follows kind of the timeline of how the how those songs were recorded,
Right.
and to the point where the last song is Monster Magnet's unfinished, according to Zappa.
Yeah, exactly.
And he had most of the kitchen and the kitchen sink in that song. Apparently wanted the bathtub as well. He missed a few things, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know if he ever thought through this process that he would be able to record a second album. I think once he got into this process, I think this was, how far can I take this? And how far are they going to let me go with this? And when he realized, well, he's kind of got them by the short and curlies, like at some point they're committed into this process.
Yeah.
He continued to take it to what, to the conclusion it became.
Right.
And I think the victory of Zappa was how he did that, and how he controlled the process, how he used the freaks, how he used his band, how he used the machine, the recording machine, the industry to craft this journey of recording the album. So I think the album itself it exists as a concept album, as a thing, and I think there's a bigger performance art piece that also exists that has the same name as this album, but it's actually, you'd have to look at it sort of as a a historical performance art piece, and that was kind of how I looked and reconciled myself to how the album sort of came and it into the form it arrived.
And I would go a little further in my thinking with that to the track Motherly Love.
Yeah, okay.
Where this album is about how messy things are in many ways. You listen to that track like Motherly Love, and the song is about what groupies or people who they would be attracted to or be attracted to them, what they can expect of the mothers, right? The Mothers of Invention, Motherly Love. And so you have this twist of motherly love.
Right.
It's not about this loving care between a mother and its child, right? So there's a kind of messiness about love that comes up in that song. And I think the reason why I'm going there is because what I got out of this through line you're mentioning is how messy recording is. And how when an album is done, by and large, this is a generalization, so I'm fully open to any criticism on this, but
Sure.
So I think so many albums are created with the intent to hide the truth. And it's not bad. It's not a bad thing. You do how many takes of that guitar part? You did 5, you did 6, you did 8.
It's the nature of idealizing anything, or an idealization, or the ideal, right?
Yeah. And you can spin it a lot of different ways. You can say that's the artistry of it, it's the craft, and that's fine. But I think specifically with this album, there's a demonstration of, okay, if you want strawberries, you're going to have to realize that they were growing in compost. If you want to have that car, you need to realize that it's a messy business to run this thing, right? Like, no one puts their hands, well, very few people put the hands in the oil that manages them to get around, right? So there's a thing about Zappa's music overall where he's very, even in his demeanor, I've found that he's very comfortable with the messiness of life. And so I'm with you on that through line of this album also demonstrating an art performance piece and going to those places that some performance pieces go to, where they demonstrate this primordial mess which is fertile soil for what people would rather just be picking and consuming.
Sure.
And I think that was the other thing that really stuck out for me about this album, is that because when I've done it, I've done pieces in my life where it's improvised. Can't speak. Improvised, and I'm not worried about what the outcome's going to be. This is just me in the moment, conveying these things, speaking or playing or whatever it may be, and so the last 3 tracks have that quality. I mean, in the liner notes, this is what freaks sound like when you turn them loose in a recording studio at 1 o'clock in the morning on $500 worth of rented percussion equipment. A bright, snappy number. Hocha.
Right.
So there's that acknowledgement that things are messy. And like he is too. And he doesn't hide that.
Right. Though I don't think for Zappa, I don't think he includes himself as the freaks in this. Like I think the freaks and the freaks were a very very specific niche of a cultural moment in LA. So very specifically, they weren't the hippies.
No.
They were something very specific. I think he used them compositionally. I think he used the idea of freaks as a unifying color in this album.
Yeah.
In the same way he used other elements and other textures. I think they're a compositional element to the performance art as well as just to the concept of the album.
Totally there with you.
Yeah.
But I think what I was getting at, maybe I misunderstood what you said, but he's okay with that.
Oh, yeah. He's has
okay
to be.
He's okay with it. So whether he identifies, I don't think he identified in that as a freak either.
Yeah.
But I felt at times that he was, the concept of freak was it was actually liberal. It was liberal beyond that particular, it was like a kind of a mixture of California hippies and pacifists, I believe. Like it was a community of sorts, or as a designation for a view of a community. And I wonder if at times he was using it to maybe refer to how it's more nuanced than people were associating it or referring to it.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people historically that weren't attached to that moment in time to I think the differentiation between sort of the specifics of freak culture there have been lost to sort of a generalized sense of freaks, which has been sort of blended in with sort of just counterculture and hippie. But it was something very, very, very specific. To me, it was almost a sort of, Zappa being born in 1940, he's not a boomer, right? And he's more informed by the beats, in terms of where they were taking culture and how they criticized culture at the time. And I think he was equally criticizing them, because I think that, the arc of the beats into the hippies and the crossover there and the messiness of it.
Yeah.
I think there was a little break, and the freaks were sort of an old beat guru wannabe that sort of was the lord of that scene in LA.
Yeah, that's something I can't. Yeah, that's something I can't speak to. I don't know enough about it. Like because I don't think I delved deep enough into what that freak designation in that culture is. So I fully admit there's some limit to where I can go with it.
Sure, but I'll get back to the mess.
Right.
They were messy. Like
right.
Like those, and I think, like, when you talk about, I think Zappa, when you read the Zappa book, that he wrote, and how he sort of looks back on his life. I mean, you're seeing a guy who saw mess in a lot of things, mess because it was there, but was glossed over.
Yeah.
So his orientation in the world is that the world is a mess. And so I'm going to sit here. I'm comfortable in mess because it's always been a mess, right? And so I'm going to strip away the gloss from what when you pretended there wasn't a mess, and you pretended your mother wasn't on Valium, and and your father wasn't either a wage slave or or an alcoholic or whatever. And as that scene, and even as the Beat sort of criticized sort of that pre and war America, every counterculture kind of falls apart into its own mess. And I think Zappa just was equally sitting there sort of as a critical eye on it all, and just took the mess that was in front of him to show the mess that was behind him.
Right.
Because the freaks were a byproduct of doo-wop gloss,
right.
And I think what Zappa thought was like, possibly that how can you get more messy than this? Morally, the freaks were a real mess, hedonistic and individualistic and express like no rules expressionist, lots of stuff going on. I think he thought it was the ultimate mess at the time. And for it was historically at that point a very sort of like, look at what we've become. Ta-da, we maybe always were this. I just but yeah, very comfortable in the mess, because I think everything was a mess. Love was a mess. I've always got the sense of Zappa as sort of sitting on a chair, sort of as an observer, and just holding up a certain kind of mirror through a Zappa filter that sort of showed you his reflection of the world, and past and present. So the mess that you talk about, and Zappa being comfortable with it, I think that is something that orientation towards mess is something that he has from his past leading up to that moment. And it's where he takes things beyond this album, after this album, the time period that this album continues. But I'm definitely interested in sort of hearing a little bit more about your specific experience with the album, as a totality, outside of that arc of the pulling apart of the monster magnet. Is there a climax to that for you? Is there, how does the album leave you?
Well, I feel that there is no climax in a way, because the last track, as you get to the end of it, everything speeds up.
Yeah.
Everything moves into a higher register. All the energies go up. Range, register, and speed. And I don't think the album actually has a climax. And that's the most unsettling part about it, in terms of what you've just talked about, in terms of mess. Or in terms of how Zappa is looking at things.
Yeah.
So for me, I find that the process is the thing. The process of the whole album, just as you can listen to individual tracks, of course, but we're doing this podcast partially to talk about the experience of a concept album.
Sure.
So by default, that's the whole thing. and I think that the album is very directional.
Yeah.
And it's just leading out of itself. It's its own channel. Right?
I
it presents
that
itself and
it
then it's
leads
gone.
out of itself.
Yeah.
Because I think it self-destructs or deconstructs what it just did.
Yeah, it's deconstruction.
So and that lack of fundamental climax is a necessity of that, because it's not climax of like a creative moment. It's the deconstruction as a creative moment, and
I think that's why that magnetism imagery was so strong for me, because when something is moving away from you at such a high velocity, such a high intensity, you lose a sense of its shape, its position, its nature, and where it's going.
Yeah.
And so that's the other part about the magnetism aspect. Instead of just talking about how the album is undoing the magnetic pull of American glossy culture, however you want to put it. I mean, these generalizations are always precarious.
Yeah.
But there's also the other side of what are these things being attracted to.
Right.
So things aren't really coming apart.
And
they're just moving around.
For sure. And then the question of that last track being unfinished. Is it unfinished? Because it isn't the nature of that deconstruction that it has to be unfinished.
Well, I think that for me, that kind of consideration comes back to thinking about Zappa himself.
Yeah.
And it brings me back to, I don't really know this person.
Yeah.
And I don't know well enough to speak about it in terms of that's what he wants us to think. I don't know how far is he really playing, for another analogy, is he playing a magician who has to live the act to such depth that you will not get the access you think you can get from this person?
Yeah.
And that takes me back to what I said at the beginning, which was hard for me about Zappa. Because at that time, because of my own passion for music, my own passion to express myself and what I was going through, listening to Zappa's music and seeing how my friends were relating to it, nothing against them, but they were titillated by the sexual innuendo or the literal sexual commentary. They were titillated by saying funny things and using a xylophone to, in a Spike Jones kind of way.
Yeah.
And for them, that was where it was. And that's fine, because that is certainly an experience of it and a level of it. But for me, it was, I don't know where this person is in all of this. And I didn't realize at that age that actually that's kind of perceptive to be confused that way, to say, wait a minute, I don't really know where this person is coming from.
Yeah.
So there's another album that Zappa did. I can't remember which one it was, but he worked with an orchestra. And on the back of the album, so if anyone knows, please let us know. He actually makes a statement that this performance is of poor quality. And I can't quote it verbatim, but the attitude is we couldn't pull it together and it's not good enough, but here it is.
Yeah.
Who would do that? And why would they do that? Right? And so for me, I believe that apart from the insight of being a guitar player, a composer who plays guitar, the other thing about Zappa is life is really messy. And what people are presenting to you, their personas, their masks, their manners, their behaviors, their desires, their fears, all that kind of stuff. It's a messy collective within this messiness that we exist in. And the funny part about it for me is that with Zappa, along with what we're talking about, he was also often referred to as a perfectionist. So if the album isn't finished the way it is,
yeah,
the way it's supposed to be, why did you release it anyways?
Because we know he shelved lots of things, right, and didn't release them. So then that, aside from the general idea of Zappa as enigma, which I mean, it's its own trope already, right?
Yeah.
I really think he is an enigma in the sense I think he's your classic unreliable narrator that you can't. You can't take what he says at any given point in time as it's some sort of truth. It's just another element within the narrative that you got to figure out. When I see him, even when he talked about Freak Out, I didn't believe half the shit he talked about. In terms of he had his story that was as much a part of the performance of creating that album and about curating it post creation.
Yeah.
There's there's he's constantly weaving a mythology and reinforcing a mythology. Which is fine because that's part of the mystique and part of the enigma, and it's also it's fun, right, to sort of to encounter that, but there really is there is that we have this album, and as you listen to this album, and the more you think about it, the more you feel it. There are doors that open up within your experience of the album that create new narratives every time you go through it, and that's something that I still love about all concept albums, but I'm really glad to have been able to find in this one, because the Zappa figure, the Zappa enigma, the Zappa narrative is so strong.
Yeah.
I thought it would get in the way of that experience for this album. Like you talked about, you had to sort of take off your history with Zappa before you could get back to listen to it. Because Frank he's omnipresent. He's there. So stripping that away and ignoring it or letting it live in a different sort of temporal space while you engage with the work again, I think allows it to yield something different and something very important. And my appreciation for Frank and for this album in particular, it has been so enriched by being able to strip that off. Having, like you had an experience of Zappa, came to Zappa through Steve Vai, or through the sort of the even pre-Steve a little bit, in the sense that Zappa was when I can remember being 13. Having arguments with my grandfather about, composers and referencing, well, Frank Zappa's a composer, and having never heard a single Frank Zappa song, try to, my grandfather was a conservatory trained violinist, and here I am, arguing with him about composers.
Right. And when I was at university, I encountered some of that as well.
Yeah.
And like that album I talked about, him working with an orchestra, maybe he recorded with them on purpose.
Maybe. Right
from the start, because he knew there would be a pushback. Like the Frank Zappa album that I've really enjoyed the most is actually his last one, The Yellow Shark.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. And it was interesting I went and listened to it as well. And how it's with Ensemble Moderne, and it's all that ensemble playing his selected works, and you can tell they're having a great time. And so, what you're saying about what his intentions are and where he's coming from, that's something, you're right. I had to just let go of where I was with that at a certain age and look at it where I am now. And I'm okay with that. I'm very much okay with it. But the reason why I'm okay with it is because I don't really need to figure it out.
Right.
I got my own stuff to do. So, you know, there's been moments when I've been listening to the album and thinking about what I gained from Frank Zappa. Just that comic composer that plays guitar. And then I think about the title of Shut Up and Play Your Guitar.
Yeah.
It's like, you don't have to listen to me. I did my thing, I'm doing my thing, and it's going to go, like you said, there's that other part when we release the music, when you release the album, there's all that other stuff that happens, and a lot of it you don't have access to, right? And so revisiting this album has been really great for me. This conversation has been amazing, and the big reason why it's been amazing has been to come to peace with something I didn't know that I needed to, which is that very idea of letting go, of trying to figure it out.
Right.
And then I think also just what we talked about here, where we had a very similar through line, but we characterized it in different ways.
Yeah, and you know, for anyone listening, this is our first conversation about, like, in any real conversation about Zappa, but specifically about this album. And so, you know, we're still sort of in the moment, looking for language and trying to find our way through this. So it'll be interesting as we go on in our lives, you know, what other conversations we'll have about Zappa. Amazingly, this is the first album.
Yeah.
How much is in it? How much is in this album? How many suggestions of things to come and places to go, all in this album. And if you know anything about Frank's catalog, massive. You know,
62 albums.
Yeah.
And then posthumously, I think 58, 57, something like that. I think the vault has still got stuff in it.
Yeah, apparently. And just a rich, amazing body of work that you could spend a lifetime exploring and re-experiencing. That's the one thing. As I get older, I'm this way with albums, and I'm this way with novels. When I was young, I'll read everything. You know, like, I'll have time to read everything.
Yeah.
So as we get on in life, you start to realize, you know, like, I'm not going to be able to listen to every Frank Zappa album, you know, or in its entirety, multiple times. I mean, you know, or if I do, I'll have to devote a significant portion of the remainder of my life to do that. You know, like,
that's right.
So there's so many things out there that as you get older, you realize that you're not going to experience. It's why in my life, I like to, like, when I travel, we've talked about this a little bit. I'm not running to the next town to see the Wat in that town, or the next temple in the town after that. I want to spend my time in the place I'm at. I want to go deeper there, you know, which is why I think concept albums themselves yield so much richness for me, is because I get to go deep into where I already am. I'm not running to the next place to see the superficial layer of, or to get that first new experience of a quick new thing. I want to get deeper on an older thing, you know, I want to get deeper on a thing. But time is finite, and
well, I'm there with you on getting into a thing. You know, if I'm in a place, I don't want to try and see everything in a country. I'd rather know a town, a village, a family. So I guess we've gotten very close to the town of Zappa, which is embodied in Freak Out. Is that a way we could put it? Yeah, I know we're wrapping up here. Real quick question: favorite moment on the album? Favorite song? Do you speak in those terms? It depends. Yeah. Well, I think for this album, that through line is really. I mean, it's a concept album, so the through line is really important. But I brought up Brain Police, so I was really taken by that track, and I really liked the whole shape of the album. Yeah, I wouldn't pick one track for this, and I think that that just means that it would be hard for me to listen to one track. I'm not going to say, oh, I want to listen to Wowie Zowie. I'm going to say I'm going to listen to Freak Out now, and I go through the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a couple of tracks that stood out a little bit for me. But like you, I like, there's definitely tracks that I wouldn't go, like, I wouldn't choose to go listen to Wowie Zowie, but I'll listen to Wowie Zowie within the context of listening to the album. No problem there. Tracks I liked, I loved Trouble Every Day.
Yeah. Well, that's about the Watts riots.
And one of the things we didn't really bring up, but I was going to say in this work in particular, I was sort of struck by the absence of anything to do with Vietnam, and I'll leave that as an open-ended thought for anyone listening. But pleased to see race brought up several times, and the Zappa being famous for, having an integrated band being something very important to him. And, now whether that was because it thumbed its nose at society or whether that embodied his value system, someone else can argue, but, I think it was genuine. And I like that several places on the album. And I loved a couple little funny moments about khakis of but I ironed my khakis, or I hate you, but hey, I got new khakis. There were some funny little moments that I really liked, but the Trouble Every Day reminded me a little bit of Bob Dylan. It reminded me of Sixto Rodriguez as well, like in that same sort of compositional element, and some very similar sort of rhythms and timbers to how they spoke. A lot of, again, we talked really early in the conversation about things that were suggestive of tangents and where things went. You can track different elements of this album right through every sort of movement in popular music, up to and including hip hop, and rap, and like you can this is a point of origin that a lot of people didn't know existed.
It
in
really
this way.
feels like it is. I think I would have to do a lot more digging to be sure about that, but I feel that there is definitely a point of origin that I feel from it. And what I mentioned earlier on before we finish up is a tip of the hat to Tom Wilson.
Yes.
The producer who went ahead and got them the record deal and got on the phone and made sure the album was able to finish. And I think if I had more time, I would have done more digging into the particulars of that, if it was possible to find it.
Yeah, I would have liked to have seen his account of that. Like I've read Zappa's account of it and reference to him. But I mean,
every time I read about it, the album's production, he always mentioned how this album would never have happened without Tom Wilson. Saying, okay, let's sign these guys, let's do this album.
And there were a lot of A&R guys of that era that were the ones that we hear about, like Tom, in several other bands and little moments in recording history that bridged that sort of old world A&R corporate kind of thing, and was opened up the doors to the new, and there's probably a great meta history out there of those guys. I mean, there's every time I encounter some artist's story from back in the day, there's always that guy,
Well, and this is something I think that we have mentioned already in previous episodes about the life of making these albums. I mean, there's so many components to it that aren't planned. That happen, that enable things to be what they are. But then there is also somebody who will take a risk, take a chance, or fight to have whatever is being done completed or realized.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to remember with any creative endeavor, is that advocacy component.
Yeah, because this came out on a label.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Yeah.
and Frank was able to keep that door open for as long as he wanted before he, you know, did his own thing. And that's, I mean, how crazy is that? You know, given what it was.
Yeah.
And where it, you know, where in time it came. Like, I mean, we're, Tom, thank you, Tom.
Yes.
I've got him in my mind. He probably looks completely different, but in my mind, I sort of see him.
You know, he worked with Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel, Velvet Underground.
Wow.
Yeah, so he seemed to have, at least from what I can tell, he seemed to have a very open and passionate regard for the recording of albums, and he was able to really pick people who he thought should be in the studio.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a pleasure, Joël.
As always.
This has been a great conversation, but equally the experience of sort of living with this album. I mean, I've only just begun to talk about it in some ways, right? Like it was a real treat. So, you know, I think back to just Frank and the legacy that he left us and everyone that participated in that. Thank you. This is awesome.
And how Dweezil is continuing to play his music and share it with other people.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, you know, Dweezil, we could do a show on Dweezil, or 10 shows. He's, the fact that he's been playing his dad's music, and I can only imagine what his handle of the catalog is, you know, like, he's got it. He must know it.
Or he's trying to know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's trying to know. I've seen some interviews with him just talking about trying to figure out how his dad did what he did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is really beautiful.
Yeah. Well, and he has the music to sort of find his way, you know, to his dad, both at different points in his dad's life, you know, and, you know, that's, losing your father when you're younger is, tough, you know, and, yeah, I'm glad for Dweezil to have such a legacy to sort of look back and re-experience his father on, and
share it with other people.
Yeah. Have you seen the Play Zappa? Did you?
Only on recordings.
Yeah,
I haven't caught a live show, but I would like to.
Yeah. Well,
whenever that happens.
Yeah. Once the apocalypse is finished, maybe we'll see a show one day. Anyway, thanks very much, Joël.
Thanks, Rob.
A real pleasure.